Today's view is socks. Say hello, socks. No, you're just confused. And do you need flea medicine again? What the hell is it with you cats? Well, today's genre is what I call Atomica. I've heard it called other things. I originally um, read the description, read about it as atomic horror, which is kind of fitting because it tends to lean into horror, but it doesn't have to. So if it doesn't use horror all the time, then it's just atomic. And atomic sounded a bit weird, so I chose Atomica. Um, it is the genre that is also called atom punk, but that, for reasons I'm going to go into in a moment, I feel is a wildly misleading name for the genre. The genre basically takes all of the tropes of old American B movies and make them into a fairly logically consistent world. Not in that it's realistic in any way. You have giant insects, you have swamp monsters, you have space aliens and stuff like that. But it has a certain consistency. The idea being that as America rose in the 50s as an atomic power, that had consequences. The two main kind of consequences is that it attracted, um, I wanted to say people, but life that has issues with something as powerful as the atomic bomb, which is usually aliens, but it has also been other things, like intelligent creatures from the ocean and stuff like that. In a way, I guess that the movie The Abyss kind of leans into to that as well. That was just a stray thought. I'm sorry, but that's one of them. That intelligent life starts worrying about humans becoming very powerful with atomic weapons and also atomic energy. But usually, it's the A bomb that triggers it. But the other one is the idea that technologies like the A bomb start to cause changes and create monsters. And yes, that does mean that Godzilla is essentially Atomica. Uh, but most Atomica takes place in the US, and a lot of that has to do with the entire mentality around these national powers that come from acquiring nuclear technology. It's very, it leans very much into the American spirit, exaggerated to, I wouldn't say ludicrous proportions. Now that we see what people around the world can decide to do when they get a little taste of power, but it is exaggerated in a sometimes comical way, sometimes unintentionally comical way, with bravado and typical American Pax Americana overconfidence, America as the leader of the world, and stuff like that. And it takes that serious. The reason that this exaggeration does not warrant, in my belief, the title Atomic Atom Punk is that Atomica is often very pro government. very pro big institutions, and especially very pro government. It does acknowledge at times that there are mishaps, that there are cover ups, that there is corruption, and that there is incompetence, even at the highest echelons of government. But it essentially, at its core, assumes that a government, or at least the American government, is there for the people. Ironically, um, it doesn't seem to say a lot about other governments, almost ignoring their existence, which is why it's a bit odd to call Godzilla Atomica, even though it fits the bill in many ways, because that's Japanese. Um, but even that does seem to, in most incarnations, assume that governments are the ones who will, in one way or another, deal with the problem. There's a lot of confidence in the typical male, physically fit, often military type characters to be heroes, to be strong and valiant and courageous, and most of all, good, morally good. And the American way of life is treated as an absolute positive in much of Atomica. So it does become this kind of more fantasy, perhaps, than any punk genre. But well, I guess there is magic in the form of all the crazy sciences, but it's not a magic that is usually used in the same way. Then again, and I correct myself because I'm realizing this as I say it. By the way, these are not scripted. Go figure. Uh, some of the magic, I guess, does go into the field when some science character tags along, or someone with technological gadgets. Um, on some occasions, special agents from the government who very often do not get assigned any agency, it's just special agents from the government, or G-men. I think G-men is technically FBI, but they do not often get portrayed as specific agency people. When they take gadgets and ver- various science tools into the field, it does get a bit magicy, but it's not spellcaster magic, and it's not great complicated magics. It's usually just technologies that can solve some interesting problems, um, or are a danger, a problem, I guess. Technology is problems, technology is solutions, but the heroes tend to be big, strong men, usually white suburban kinds, but that does vary, and especially in modern rethinkings of the genre, there is variations with more rural types, or more very urban types, or non-white types. I have even seen examples of um, non-cis hetero heroes, sadly often tragic heroes in Atomica like fiction. So it's not a rule, but it is a trend that the main characters, at least on the heroic side, are the stereotypical white cis hetero, often male, and often at least pro government, if not actual government people. And the two main kinds of stories are the fight against evil people, which here includes aliens or any other sentient being, who try to threaten the American way of life or just the American government or people, and rampant monsters. There are cases of misunderstood monsters, which stand out even more in this genre, considering the simplicity. But a lot of it is about figuring out why monsters are there and how to do something about it, or to get to some evil cretin who is threatening everyone with some dark science or something like it. There is there is the possibility of leaning against the detective noir genre, and it does happen, but leaning too much very easily slips out of the genre because Atomica, even when it's done in a serious way, is kind of goofy. It is the fantasy tropes put into a non fantasy 50s America, with simplicity being good, complexity being evil, most of the time at least, um, with simple power structures and strong, valiant heroes against nefarious villains. It it does lean into simplicity. It doesn't have to, but it does lean into it a lot. But that can be very fun as well. Um, Even when evil is not great, world destroying evil, it can be very tense and very amusing. For one thing, because there is a very strong trope in Atomica that the valiant, strong, and well armed heroes engage some kind of threat, and weapons just don't cut it. The monster is impervious to bullets for some reason. The UFO cannot be shut down. Uh, the evil genius is hidden somewhere and cannot be simply approached directly. So there is often a rejection of powerful tools in favor of powerful people. It is very much a genre that celebrates the triumph of the human spirit, even if it does so in kind of goofy and oversimplified ways. And it also does take some interesting looks at technology from time to time. This has been kind of warped a bit as time has moved on, and Atomica has become more of a, I don't know if you call it a legend genre, but an old genre now that it's not looking so much to the future as it is imagining how other people saw the future, because the views of technology have changed and a lot of more focus has come on lesser consequences of technology, on complication, on details of technology, whereas classic Atomica is perhaps more aimed at technology being this kind of confusing but very powerful thing. The nuance came later in many cases. Um, but it is fantasy for uh, middle class America in the 50s very much, and many things can likely be interpreted like that. You can take ideas from fantasy and kind of model some equivalent in the Atomica genre. Um, one variation on Atomica I want to get into that has been sort of popularized lately um, is what I would call high atomica. What I've described now can perhaps be described as low atomica, and this would be high atomica, just like low fantasy and high fantasy, because there is the idea that what would happen if atomica continued to evolve, and a lot of that I believe is spurred by the Fallout games that portray a world before a nuclear disaster that was essentially atomica, but much more. It had nuclear powered cars. It had robot servants. It had all kinds of crude but advanced technologies that played into the Atomica spirit, including the stuff about corruption and valiant heroes. I haven't played the games enough to know the depth of the world design of the world before nuclear disaster. I know it's very well designed after, but the world before, I don't have as much info on. But it does step into this retro futurism idea of how would an advanced future look from the perspective of someone living in the 50s. And there is a lot of stuff that can get very interesting there, but it does start to leave the Atomica genre behind a bit and get more goofy, sometimes get more deep and detailed. I've seen people that I think have been inspired by the same sources trying to evolve it into a genre, and in some cases very well. Sadly, it's still a lot of focus on the visuals, focus on gimmicks and gadgets, but the genre as well. Um, and high Atomica sometimes leaves the safe little corner of pure good institutions versus evil outsiders. I mentioned that Atomica usually doesn't talk much about other countries. High Atomica does take other countries more into perspective, sometimes through something that happened in other countries that relates to a story, sometimes because characters are from other countries, sometimes because they are spies or infiltrators from other countries or cooperators even from other countries, collaborators. Um, but it also lets the grip slip on the purity of the American way. It starts asking questions. It starts having large institutions not be as pure and good and trustworthy, especially trustworthy, as Atomica would usually assume they are. True to a lot of conspiratorial fiction, it's usually the um, capitalist institutions like big business that is less trustworthy, but government overreach and corruption also starts to get into it. Very often, the two are kind of combined in a new version of the military industrial complex, um, like the vaults in Fallout, as a good example, um, where government projects in private corporate hands go awry because of various issues, not limited to corruptions and cutting corners, sometimes going right into complete madness and abuse of power. Um, but it does question institutions more. And I'm running out of battery, so I will cut it out here. But yeah, Atomica, Low Atomica is very much a B movie genre, and High Atomica is more retro futuristic. But Atomica, in any shape or form, I find is very interesting genre.